Hi, greetings everyone. This is James Johnson with Tridium. I'll be your host today on this Tridium talk on enterprise systems and using Niagara provisioning. And just wanted to lay out a couple logistics maybe for the Zoom meeting today, just to let everybody know. We have disabled the audio for all the attendees, so you should be able to hear us, but you can't unmute yourself or ask a question. There is a Q&A link, questions and answers, down towards the bottom of the Zoom link, and you should be able to click on that and enter in a question if you either are having questions about how to use the meeting or something, or an actual question about the presentation. And I've got a few people on the call with me, Danielle, Therese, and Kevin with Tridium, and they're kind of helping moderate the meeting a little bit and helping with those logistics so they can try to respond to some of those questions. And the presentation will probably run about 30 to 40 minutes in length, and then we'll go through whatever the questions are in the queue related to the presentation. So hope everyone is staying safe and secure and able to get some work done, and thank you for taking the time to join us today on this presentation. I'm broadcasting today from a secure bunker / man cave here in Western North Carolina mountains, and have ample stock of everything, including technology behind me here, obviously. So I'll be using several of these Jace controllers and my PC running a web supervisor station. For the presentation, I'll be using actually a 4.9 version of Workbench, which is currently in beta testing, getting close to release. So there may be a few things that you'll see here related to provisioning specifically that aren't quite available yet that you wouldn't see in 4.8, and I'll try to make some mention of that as well. All right, so we'll get started here. And this is my supervisor station here running on my PC. And then I have 5 Jaces here as well that the supervisor is configured to talk with. And with provisioning, we have the provisioning Niagara palette. And there's a couple of things that we need in order to set up provisioning in the supervisor. And I'll just run through the basics of it real quick before I get into some of the job steps and everything. So looking under the config and the services in the supervisor station, the first thing really is that we need this batch job service, which comes from the provisioning palette. And if it's not there, you just drag it in from the palette, obviously, and add it to the services in the station. When you take a look at the property sheet on the batch job service, there's a couple of things maybe worth pointing out here. One is this job queue and this max threads. This controls how many provisioning jobs can run concurrently on the supervisor or the Jace controller, which by the way, since 4.7, we also license provisioning on the Jace 8 controllers, if you weren't aware of that, to help maybe with provisioning edge controllers underneath the Jace. The other thing that was added in 4.7 is this max provisioning threads property. And this allows a provisioning job to run multiple threads at the same time so that the job can process faster, doing things in parallel. So just be aware of those settings. There's some things that you can adjust there based on the performance of the PC and what access you have. Now, the other piece to provisioning is this provisioning NW extension. And this needs to be under the Niagara network. So if it's not there, you can drag it out from the palette onto the Niagara network here. And when you drag that out, what you'll notice is underneath some of the, or all of the Niagara stations, actually, it will add some mix-in properties there when you add that provisioning extension. So you'll see things like the platform connection, this station proxy, software backup, licenses, templates, and device bootstrap. All those extensions are added in as mix-ins whenever the provisioning is enabled. The platform connection is very similar to this client connection, which is what we set up the credentials to connect from station to station. The platform connection is telling the supervisor how to connect from the supervisor to the platform of that remote station, whether it's a Jace or a PC-based station. When you take a look at the station manager view then, and you edit one of those station connections or batch edit, you'll see that the credential store here is for that station connection, the client connection. And then we also have a platform user, password, secure platform, and platform port here as well. So you can see the status of the platform connection here. You can edit that information here, or there's also an alternate provisioning manager view that you can use, which basically just lets you adjust the platform credentials only. So that's really the basics to getting it set up. We need that batch job service, and then we need that provisioning extension under the Niagara network, and then we need to make sure that the platform credentials are configured for each of the stations. And the provisioning extension itself has a view on it here, which allows us to build up jobs and run those jobs. So basically you have two panes here, a top pane that allows me to pick some limited number of job steps here, and then the middle pane, which has a much more comprehensive list of job steps. And if you haven't looked at these job steps recently, since 4.6, we've been adding lots and lots of job steps so that we can more easily manage the Niagara systems. And you can select a job step like backup stations here, for example. And in the bottom pane, we simply click and then select either all the stations or some subset of stations that we might want to do that, process that action on that step. So backup stations in this case. Now, on this provisioning view, you really only have the option to build the job and run it right now. But if I want to maybe build a job that I would reuse again and again in the same station or from station to station, then this job view here isn't quite the one that I want to use, because I really can't save the settings. It's just a way that I can build that job and then run it instantly. Now, that has good purposes though still, so don't be afraid to run jobs from here as well. What I tend to do though is use the wiresheet view of that provisioning extension. And in the wiresheet view, then I'll add a job prototype, a Niagara Network job prototype from the palette. So this is kind of the basic, hello world simple example would be to drag this network job prototype out, and maybe I'll call this weekly backup. And when I look at the default view on the prototype here, it has a Niagara Network prototype view on that. And this view is going to be very similar to the view that I was just showing you on the provisioning extension. Really, the only difference is that there's a save button here. So what that means is I could click on the add here and select backup stations as the job step. And then in the stations to include, I could, select desired stations here, some subset or all of them, and then I can save that job. And what that allows me to do now is perhaps in the wiresheet here, I can link a trigger schedule into the submit job action. And now I can have a trigger schedule set up for once a week on Sunday at 3:05 a.m. to fire, and it'll run this job and it'll process the job on a weekly basis. So I can perform that job repeatedly without any kind of human interaction if I need to. When we look at the job view, there's also a prototype job list view, and this does two things for us. It shows us when the job's been run, or I can submit the job, and it also has a retention policy here. And this is an important part because the retention policy by default is retained permanently. And there's a number of options here with the retention policy. I can dispose of after a specified amount of time. So if I select that option, you get a field editor where I could say after 30 days, I want to dispose of whatever resources are associated with this job and whatever job logs. Or everybody likes a good execution, so maybe keeping a limited number of executions. The first option applies to all stations in the job. It's a little bit maybe more limiting. So let's say, for example, I set this to 2. If the station was down and it didn't really do a backup, then it would still purge out maybe the executions. So we also have an option to keep a limited number of executions per device. And this might allow me to configure something along those lines, where I'm keeping 2 successful, maybe 1 unsuccessful for some reason if I wanted to. This goes to cleaning up a couple of things. One is that if you look under the file space in the station, there's a batch job folder, and then logs. So underneath here, there will be batch job log files that are saved for each time that a job's been executed. So that's part of why we want to limit the number of executions that we retain, so it automatically goes through and cleans up these batch job logs and doesn't fill up the hard drive space. Given that this is a job to backup stations, I would also want to limit those number of backups that I kept. Otherwise, I'd fill up the hard drive. So running provisioning jobs is sort of like watching paint dry or watching grass grow. It's not real exciting. You can see that both the stations are running backups concurrently in this job, because the provisioning batch job service has the setting to use multiple threads in the same job, so that can speed up and do parallel execution. So you can see those went through and succeeded. You can click on individual line items here and on the double chevron, and it'll show you the details. In this case, it's telling me the location of where it saved that backup dist file to. In this case, it's under the protected station home location under a provisioning Niagara folder, and it includes the full path to those backup dist files. You can also simply click on the view log here, and that's going to show you the full list instead of looking at the individuals. I can see it in kind of a flat list here and see all the things that succeeded or failed maybe as that job ran. So that's just a real basic rundown of a very simple job, right, with one step. So what we're going to do is maybe dig in a little bit deeper into some other examples of some batch jobs here, or some provisioning jobs. To start off with, you can see in this case, I have 3 of my stations which are already communicating from the supervisor to the JACE without any exceptions using TOS. But 2 of my stations, maybe I've just connected onto the network and I haven't set up and provisioned the certificates yet. So I don't have connectivity without going and creating host exceptions. And I'm not going to get into the weeds about certificate management, because this is really meant to be focused on provisioning and not get into cybersecurity in a lot of detail. But I do want to give you just a little bit of the basics here so you can understand what I'm doing with the job. I'm going to take a look at the certificate manager service in the supervisor station. And in the key store here, you'll see that I have a signed certificate, which I'm using for the supervisor, for the Fox and the web and the platform. And I also have a CA certificate, an intermediate certificate for a certificate authority. So I've set up my own local certificate authority here. And looking at the certificate, I can see, looking at the key usage in this case, this is for certificate signing. It's not for web server authentication. This is actually a CA certificate that's in my key store. And this certificate is signed by a root training certificate, and I have imported that root training certificate here into my station, this one that says training CA root certificate. So this is what I'm using for my certificate authority on my supervisor station. Now, when it comes to setting up the certificates on the remote stations, we have a lot of job steps that are available in the provisioning now to help with managing those kinds of tasks. And I've got a job set up here, but I'm going to step through each of the pieces parts of this job step. In the top pane here, we have certain job steps that we can run. And one of those is enable Bootstrap mode. And what the Bootstrap mode does is it sets the supervisor in a special state where it's okay to make a connection to that remote station, even if it has, say, a default system passphrase, or it has a default admin user with a default password, or it has a self-signed certificate and a host exception hasn't been approved. So what Bootstrap mode does is it lets it create temporary exceptions essentially through provisioning to allow those connections to happen. And then we can fix some of those security issues with provisioning, and then it'll disable the Bootstrap mode at the end. So in general here, with the steps, there's quite a few security related steps that we can use here. The ones in particular that we're focusing on with this would be related to the certificates. And I'll just talk through maybe some of these steps that are available. related to security in general. And when you're first commissioning, say, an edge controller, or even with JS controllers as well, there's things like we need to set a system passphrase. So there's a job step that allows me to do that. Or I need to set the platform credentials to something other than the default credentials that come with the factory condition. So there's a lot of steps associated with things like that. Now, if you're not aware of those steps, those can be real helpful as well. When it comes to the certificate management, there's a number of things that we can do, though. One thing would be to install a certificate into the trust store. So this would be a CA certificate. I have a third-party CA certificate, like in this case, I'm using my own local CA. So this first job step here is that install certificate. And when I click on OK, it's going to show me the certificates that are in the trust store in my supervisor, and I can pick from those, and then I can choose whether to use a unique alias or replace that certificate in remote station. So that's the first step here, is I want to push out my root CA public certificate out there. Then the next step is to generate a certificate. So this will create a new self-signed certificate out on the remote station. And again, I'm not going to get into all the details here. This is the same dialogue you would see if you were generating a certificate manually. And the only difference here that I'll point out is this common name field has this host name syntax in it. And what this does is it picks up on whatever the host connection information is under the Niagara network. So if I'm using IP address or DNS name, it's going to use that to fill in the common name and the subject alternative name in the certificate. So just leave that as host name, and then you can fill out the rest of the fields how you normally would when you're creating a certificate. Once we generate that certificate, we have a couple of options. If I'm using a third-party CA and I'm not acting as the CA, then one thing that we could do is export a certificate signing request. So what that would do is it would go through and create a CSR for each of those stations in the job and save them to the file space of the supervisor, and we can hand those off to the third-party CA to sign. Once they give us back the signed certificates, we put them back into a directory under the supervisor, and then we can run the import signed certificate job step. So it'll take those signed certificates and push them into the applicable key stores in each station. In my case, since I'm functioning as a certificate authority in the supervisor, we actually have a job step here to sign a certificate. So this is going to use a certificate authority that's in the key store of my supervisor to sign the certificate on the JS. It'll generate the CSR and sign it and everything in place. In this case, you have to enter in the certificate alias that you want to sign. And so I would have to remember the alias that I used on the generate certificate job step. And I'm going to show you this on the property sheet view a little bit too here in just a second. And you have an option to generate a new CA cert here, or you can use an existing one that's in your key store in the supervisor. If I selected that, then I would enter in my CA password and then the validity period for that password or for that certificate that I'm signing. Once I've signed the certificate, probably the last thing I want to do is go through the web service, Fox service, and the platform and change that TLS certificate to use my now valid trusted certificate. So again, in the provisioning job steps, we have a job step here called set certificate alias. And this is going to set the alias for the platform, the Fox, and the web services. Okay, and really nothing to configure on that job step when you add it, other than specifying the certificate alias that you want to choose there. Now, the one thing that's a little bit difficult here maybe is that once I've built these job steps, if I double click on them or right click on them, all I can do is move them up and down, add them or remove them. I don't have the ability to edit the job step or to see the job step here in this view. But I can switch to the AX property sheet view here, and you'll see the job prototype here, and I can expand that. And under the job prototype, there's stages. Now, the stages are broken into two things, which are based on those two panes there at the top of on the job view. And the initial are the job steps that would be up at the very top there, those 4 job steps we might pick from. So you can see this one is to enable the Bootstrap mode. The for each station then breaks down each of the job steps that are in that middle pane. So you can see here is the install certificate, and here's the alias of that certificate and whether I want to replace it or install unique. The second step is to generate a certificate. So you can see my alias here is Jace server. I left the host name there, filled in the other applicable information and so forth. So you can come back and edit these dates and timestamps and things like that. So once you build a job up that does this task, it's easy to come back and edit your timestamps or your alias names and things of that nature. So you don't have to rebuild that job from scratch every time. So I'll go ahead and click on run now here and let this job go through and run. Now, again, it's kind of like watching paint dry. This one should run through fairly quickly though. So again, the first thing it's doing is enabling the Bootstrap mode. So because I still have self-signed certificates or maybe expired certificates or something going on and I don't want to go through and create host exceptions, then the Bootstrap mode allows the supervisor then to make the connection to those JACEs. It's installed that root CA certificate from my local CA. It's generating those certificates on the remote stations, and that can take a little bit of time, particularly on the JACE, because it's a CPU intensive process to generate the encryption keys. And then it's going through and signing the certificate. And then the last thing it will do is it will update the alias on the web service and the Fox service and everything in the platform so that it's using that new signed certificate that should be trusted by my supervisor and Workbench and my browser clients and so forth. So it's about wrapped up here, and we can view the log. You can view the log anytime, even when there's still stages running and that sort of thing. But you can view the log and go back and look through and see all the steps that have been completed and what's been performed for each individual station. And we should be able to invoke a ping here, hopefully. If, connection refused. I probably have the wrong credentials set on my stations here right now. Let's see. All right, just trying to connect. Okay, so I just had the wrong credentials set up in the in my supervisor there. So now they're able to connect without an TLS exception, which is what I was after with that provisioning job. And I use some text blocks here in the wire sheet, maybe just to also explain what the job's doing, just if anybody else is coming back behind me here. Now, in addition to doing things like that, there's a lot of other options here, and I'm going to open up another nav bar here just to make this a little bit easier, so I don't have to maybe scroll up and down. And I'll just go into my building 4 station here. So in this station, obviously, I've got the Niagara network and the building supervisor is there, but that station is still disabled, right? So if I take a look at the Niagara network station manager view here, we should see, this will load for me. Come on. Maybe that was a bad decision. Of course, there's no way to cancel what Workbench is doing until it times out. There we go, finally. So you can see that it's disabled. It has the wrong IP address. There's no credentials set up in that reciprocal connection or anything. So another thing that we might want to do is to modify that reciprocal connection in the remote station. So looking at the provisioning service here, there is a setup reciprocal connection job step. Set up reciprocal connection. So this sets up the Niagara network connection in the remote station coming back to the supervisor. And really what you're doing here is just entering in what's the account name that you want it to use, what's the password, right? And then what would be the IP address or the DNS name, like bldg1 soup.training.lan or something of that nature. So that's really all you have to do is enter in the account name you want it to use, the password, and then whatever those credentials are. And if I run that job, then what that should do is go through and set up that remote connection in the JACE back to the supervisor. So that can be real helpful, in particular, if maybe I need to update connections for security purposes or things like that. So I could go through and looking at the Niagara network connection over here now, you can see in the JACE that now it's updated the address and the credentials and everything, and the connection is okay now. So without me having to go around to every station to do that, I'm able to make those those sort of changes. If it was more of a like an update situation, like I wanted to maybe I think my account is compromised, for example, then here's an example where what I want to do is add a new station user. So in the job steps, we have a add station user job step. And when you select on that, you get the option to put in a username. Like maybe I'm changing the account, the system service, and then I'll double enter a password. And you can create that user with the admin role if you need to. Or if not, then once you create the user, then you could change the user's role with a set property job step. And I'll talk a little bit more about some set property job steps here in just a second. So then instead of, there's really kind of two options to go here. Like if I wanted to just update that remote user, there's a set station user password job step. So let's say I don't want to change the username, but I want to change the credentials of that account out in the remote station that the supervisor is connecting to the JACE with. So the set station user password job step, it uses the connection user under the Niagara network by default, but you can clear that checkbox and enter in any username that's in the JACE station. But in this case, if I left it on use connection username, I would put in the current password, double enter new password. What that would do, and then it would also update the Niagara network connection with those new properties in the supervisor, so it knows that I'm changing that remote password there. The other option is to set the station connection credentials. So that's setting in the supervisor, that's setting the credentials on the Niagara network connection. So it's saying, here's the username to use, and here's the password to use for that connection. So it depends on whether I'm just trying to change the remote password or I'm trying to change that the user account that I want to use as well. Then the last thing maybe for cleanup in that case is I would want to remove that sys service account now that I've switched to this other account in that case. So I'll just hit run now and let that one run. And in the meantime, talk through a couple other examples of some templates here, or some provisioning jobs rather. Sorry, lost my train of thought there. So this job is designed to use some set property job steps, which is another job step that you might not be aware of. And it's going to go out to the remote stations. It's going to add a BACnet device folder named floor under the BACnet network. So right now under my BACnet network, there's no device folders here, no devices or anything underneath the BACnet network. So it's going to go out and add a device folder. It'll set the display name of that folder on each station uniquely. It'll assign a PX view to that folder, copy out a few PX files for me, and then using a template, I have a device template for a BACnet device. It'll deploy that template using a spreadsheet to actually populate BACnet devices out in a remote station. And then the last thing it does is actually runs a robot, which is provisioning robot here, to go through and do some automated tagging and data modeling for me. So taking a look at this job step, and I'll show you a little bit here in the property sheet probably as well. You can see that I'm using set property job steps. And unfortunately right here, they don't really tell you clearly what that set property job step is doing once it's there. Let me show you how you add one, and then we'll go take a look at the property sheet. You can see a little bit more about it. But there's a fairly generic set property job step here. And when you select this, then it's asking you for a target path down in that remote station. So that might be drivers slash backnet network or something like that. And then what's the name of the property that I either want to set or that I want to add? So maybe the name of the property is floor, and then I'm picking the type of component that I want to add. So I go to the backnet module and then look for backnet device folder, right? Select backnet device folder. Now, we have a property here that says add if missing. So in this case, it doesn't exist down here. I want this job step to add this component if it doesn't already exist in the station. And in 4.9, we actually have an ability here to then set a unique value per station. So with 4.8 and 4.7, you do the set property job step. It just sets the same property value on all stations. But in 4.9, you can actually set that to true, and then it gives me an array of things that I can change. In this case, this is the device folder. There's nothing really I can change, but I'll show you an example here in the property sheet in just a second. So that's how the set or add property job step works. You set the target order, the property name, the property type, and then possibly configure the value of that property as well that you want to add. Some of these other job steps are just using things like copy supervisor file. So I'm just copying PX files from the supervisor out to the remote stations. And then there's a deploy template job step. So there's a number of job steps that are available here related to templates. There's deploy template, and this exists in 4.8 and I think back to 4.6 at least. So we can deploy a template using a spreadsheet that allows us to key in configuration properties and things like that. I'm not going to get into all the weeds about how all those intricacies are in this presentation, but it's something more that you can take a look into. We also have installing application templates, which are application templates are for edge controllers. And then we also have job steps for, and some of these are 4.9 as well, the update template or application configuration. This is a new job step in 4.9, upgrading application templates. But we already did have an upgrade template job step as well. So these are all different job steps that are related to deploying those templates. Taking a quick look at this property sheet, and then I'm going to just let the job run and talk about a couple other things real quick with provisioning before we get to the Q&A. In this case, there's really no initial steps, but you can see here with the set property job step, it's looking under the backnet network. It's going to add a property name floor that's a backnet device folder, and it's going to add it if it's missing. And then the next job step is going to also affect the backnet network, and it's going to check the display names property. And if it doesn't exist, then it's going to add it if it's missing. And then this one is set up as a multiple target, meaning I wanted to assign different display names. So you can see here, this is where I would go in for whatever that type of property was, and I could assign unique values depending on for each station that I want to run this job against. It'll go through and execute these job steps. Like in this case, it's going to on that floor component, I'm going to add a property called floor plan, which is the PX view, and the value of it is going to set it to some PX file that I actually probably set in the provisioning job step, if I remember right, because I needed them to be set. Oh no, I'm sorry, I'm setting them unique here rather. So each one will have a unique PX file set then, instead of it being a generic property set for all of them. Okay, so in any event, I'm just going to hit run now and kind of let that job start to run. And at the same time, I'm going to just talk through a few last things on the provisioning jobs and such. So let's take a look at the wire sheet here. All right. So another one that you might find useful is, we need to set time on systems, on JACEs and things like that. You can do some of that through commissioning. Similar to that commissioning process, in provisioning, we have a set time job step here, and this sets the time for each device. And this is real similar to the interface that you will see in that commissioning interface. I could say just use supervisor time, which would be a one-time, push of setting the supervisor time to, or the JSONs to match the supervisor. You could use a selected time, so I could pick a time zone at a time, or I could configure the NTP. So instead of having to go out to each platform connection individually and set the NTP service, then we can go through and say, I want to sync at boot, use the local as a backup, if I want to generate statistics or not. And then I can enter in, NTP servers like ntp.org, say if it's the preferred one and so forth, things like that, right? You can set in an array of NTP servers. When you hit OK here, this is going to tell me changes to NTP won't take effect until the device reboots. And that's really because, NTP is a daemon that runs down at the QNX level, so we need to reboot, okay? So in that case, there's a reboot stations job step. If you look at the job steps here, there's a reboot right here, reboot each station in the job. And so I can add that job step and then run the job, obviously. In this case, I'm not going to do that because I don't want to reboot the stations while I'm running some of these other tasks like that template job, which you can see has been working in the background. It added the floor 4 in the display name, and it's in the process of deploying the BACnet devices there, and it's assigned the PX view here to my floor and that sort of thing. So you can see that job is still working in the background while I might be doing something else. Anyway, lots of job steps, a lot of security related job steps to help manage like passphrases, platform credentials, station credentials, user credentials, set TLS levels, manage PKI certificates, install certificates, and general set property jobs and things of that nature. The last thing I just wanted to show you real quick before we get into the Q&A is that underneath the provisioning extension, there are a couple of extensions here. There's the software licenses and poll scheduler. And each of the the stations underneath the stations, there are extensions for like software and licenses. And these individual software extensions basically look like the software manager view if you were to make a platform connection. So it's loading up all of the software that's available on the remote station, and it's comparing it to what's available, in the supervisor. So the supervisor version versus what's in the station. The license extension itself has an action on it to poll, and it can get some information about the license in the remote station. So the provisioning extension here itself, it can load that information in this license manager view, for example. So this is a snapshot of all the host IDs, and I can get some information about the licenses there. And the software extension is also a pretty useful one because, for example, I could pick a module like BACnet, for example, and I could tell it to check stations. And what it does is looking at snapshots that we've looked at the software that's installed on those stations, and it's showing me whether the module is installed, if it is, what version it is, if it's out of date or not. And then I could select, the out of date modules and then click create job. And what that does is it takes me straight to the provisioning extension to run a job to install this updated BACnet module on those stations that were affected. So this can be a real useful tool for helping to manage software across the portfolio to see maybe where you might have out-of-date modules installed, or to manage those types of things. So in any event, that was the quick 30 to 40 minute presentation on trying to leverage provisioning in an enterprise system, and hopefully maybe showed you some of the things that you weren't aware of with some of the job steps that we've been adding in 4.6, 4.7, 4.8, and even 4.9. So thank you guys for watching all that. Now it looks like Kevin's been mad at work answering some questions and stuff there anyway, and we have in the Q&A some questions here, so I'll try to go through a few of these questions.
My guy fell asleep, so I couldn't answer some of those.
Okay. No problem.
I think there's a bunch that
All right.
I just can't answer.
Yeah.
So
Okay. Yeah. So we've
I've
got a
kept
few
them clean.
questions. Yeah, I'll try to go through and answer what we got in the queue here. Where can I get 4.9 beta? And I guess unfortunately, I think at this point we've pretty much got beta closed. We're in the phase of wrapping up and putting the final polish on things. I think the answer is that's closed at this point in time. Let's see, can I give out the demo station? And yes, Charles, I think so. I'll work with Danielle and Therese, and we can share. If nothing else, I'll at least give a partial bog with just all the provisioning jobs set up. I don't think there's anything in the stations that I really can't share, but I'll see if I have to sanitize anything, but we can try to make those available. All right, Brad, can you explain the uses of connection timeout and socket timeout slots that are located on the provisioning NW extension property? Yeah, so when you look at the property sheet here on the provisioning extension, there's some connection timeouts here, socket timeout, station shutdown, and device reboot. So these are all used by provisioning to kind of wait, like for example, device reboot timeout. When it sends a reboot command to the Jace, it'll wait up to that length of time. It tries periodically to connect back to the station, but if it reaches that time and it gives up trying and it assumes that the reboot job failed, or if it's trying to shut down the station orderly and so forth. So provisioning does have separate tunable properties there for the connection timeout, the socket timeout, and things like that. Particularly if you're doing something across the VPN or WAN or something like that, you may need to adjust some of those properties potentially. So Brad, hopefully that answers your question. Fred wants to know, does 4.6 provisioning job work on 3.8? Provisioning can run against AX stations for the purposes of disaster recovery backups. Some of those other jobs, I think, can run against the AX stations, but for instance, you won't be able to run a provisioning robot from N4 because it's taking N4 program object essentially and trying to copy it out to an AX station and run it. So I think maybe we could do a little better job, hopefully, of putting into the help maybe which job steps could run against an AX station. Definitely the disaster recovery backup is one that will, and I'd have to go through and do some validation before I really threw out there which other ones specifically might or might not work. Depends on whether there's any client-side code that's needed or whether it's just doing something that's really done all kind of from the server side. All right. So does anything need to be configured on the Jace side to allow this to work, or we just need valid credentials? Yeah, so there's no setup required for provisioning on the Jace end or on the remote station end other than having a valid user account. So when you go into that station manager view and you're setting up the station, the client connection, and the platform connection, and it depends on the job step. Some job steps actually use the platform connection. Some job steps use the station credentials. You could still do some provisioning job steps. Some of that stuff runs over Fox. So again, it depends on which specific job step that we're talking about, but it just requires knowing what the credentials are in that remote station. All right, so Danielle's saying that we'll be posting the Q&A document on the events page as well with, with the link to the Zoom recording as well. So I got a few more minutes here. I'll try to get through, I think the questions are increasing. So we'll try to answer a few more of these, and at some point we'll probably just have to kind of draw a line in the sand, and then we'll answer them offline through, and post the questions and answers on the Tridium.com. All right, so, I should be saying done, I guess, on these. All right, Fred, can you elaborate the system passphrase on all Jaces if they have different passphrase? That's an interesting question. So when you, let's see, when you go to the set system passphrase job, it's going to ask you for the current passphrase and then the new passphrase. So unfortunately, if they all had a different passphrase, you'd still be doing onesie twosie. But if there was a batch of them, at least that had the same passphrase, then I could set the, enter that current passphrase and a new passphrase for all of them. That's particularly useful when you're deploying, say, edge controllers, because they come out of the factory with default platform credentials, default station running, and that sort of thing. So we can immediately connect to them with provisioning, and we can then change the default passphrase to something unique and set the platform credentials and that sort of thing as well. All right. So can Bootstrap be, Matt wants to know, can Bootstrap mode be used with a job to create a new station user so that access can be granted the station if credentials were forgotten? So Bootstrap doesn't preclude the need to know the user credentials to connect to the station. That just gets us past some of the security issues like unapproved host exceptions in the certificates or default system passphrase or things like that. So you still need to know some credentials to connect to the station. Now, if it was set up in the Niagara network and you didn't know what those credentials were and the supervisor could still connect to it, then yes, you could use that job to maybe add a new user that you knew the credentials for, provided the supervisor had some stored credentials in there. All right. Danielle, how are we doing on time? Are we okay to try to answer a few more questions, or?
Yeah, you can answer a couple more and then wrap it up.
Okay. And then Fred's asking, will this overrider update the current web soup connection? I'm not sure on the context of that question. If I was doing the set station user password job and I'm using the connection username here, if I leave that checked, then when I update that password in the remote station, it will also update the supervisor connection credentials as well, because it realizes we were using the connection user and changing its password. So that does update the connection as well. If not, then you can do the other job step to set the connection credentials. All right. And can the reciprocal connection task be done in 4.8? And yes, that job step exists in 4.8 as well. In regards to setting Niagara network connections, will this also work for any AXJs that resides under an enforced supervisor? So the question is can I, in regards to Niagara networks, unfortunately, Tom, I'm not clear on the question, so I'm not sure I can answer that one. I'll have to go back through and try. All right, so I think that's probably a good stopping point. We've unfortunately still got 36 questions in the queue, so definitely not going to get through all this stuff today in the call. So I'll go through and we'll try to answer these questions and then get those posted. So just wanted to say thank you guys, everybody, for taking the time to join us on the Tridium Talk here. And thank you, Kevin and Danielle and Therese, for helping with the logistics and trying to manage the meeting. So it's definitely been an interesting time these days, and hope everybody enjoyed the presentation.